Part 7. Disillusion. I was sent with a servant from Pau to Bagnères. She soon dried my tears by reminding me of the hideous blue and white knitted cuffs, which my hot and rebellious fingers had for weeks been busy in knitting for my mother, and which I should now be able to present personally. They were of a size suitable to the wrist of a man of about 8 feet, and the irregularities at the edge, where I had forgotten to slip the stitch, were concealed by stiff little ruchings of blue satin ribbon. I thought of them with unspeakable pride. We reached Bagnères after dark, and my passion of joy at seeing my mother again was heightened by the knowledge that I had so rich a gift to bestow upon her. We had late dinner, in itself an event to me, and then I tasted for the first time the delicious chemin de fer, a kind of open tart made of almond paste and oranges, covered with a crisp icing or caramel. I have never tasted this anywhere else, and though I have tried again and again to reproduce it in my own kitchen, I have never obtained even a measure of success. Even to this delicacy, the thought of those blue and white cuffs added flavour. After dinner I slipped away, and made hay of the contents of my box, till I found the precious treasures. I returned solemnly to the room where my mother was sitting by the bright wood fire, with the wax candles on a polished table. "Mamma," I said, we called our mothers Mamma in the 60s, "I have made you a present all my very own self, and it's in here." "Whatever can it be?" said my mother, affecting an earnest interest. She undid the paper slowly. "Oh, what beautiful cuffs! Thank you, dear. And did you make them all your very own self?" My sisters also looked at and praised the cuffs, and I went happy to bed. When I was lying between the sheets, I heard one of my sisters laughing in the next room. She was talking, and I knew she was speaking of my precious cuffs. "They would just fit a coal heaver," she said. She never knew that I heard her, but it was years before I forgave that unconscious outrage to my feelings. Bagnères de Bigorre is built in the midst of mountain streams. Streams cross the roads, streams run between the houses, under the houses, not quiet, placid little streams, such as meander through our English meadows, but violent, angry, rushing, boiling little mountain torrents that thunder along their rocky beds. Sometimes one of these streams is spanned by a dark arch, and a house built over it. What good fortune that one of these houses should have been the one selected by my mother, on quite other grounds, of course. And oh, the double good fortune! Even I, was to sleep in the little bedroom actually built on the arch itself that spanned the mountain stream. It was delightful, it was romantic, it was fascinating. I could fancy myself a princess in a tower by the rushing Rhine, as I heard the 4-foot torrent go thundering along, with a noise that would not have disgraced a full-grown river. It had every charm the imagination could desire, but it kept me awake till the small hours of the morning. It was humiliating to have to confess that even romance and a rushing torrent did not compensate for the loss of humdrum, commonplace sleep, but I accepted that humiliation, and slept no more in the little room overhanging the torrent. The next day was, I confess, tiresome to me, and I in consequence tiresome to other people. The excitement of coming back to my mother had quickly worn off. My mother was busy letter-writing, so were my sisters. I missed Marguerite, Mimi, even my lessons. There was something terribly unhomelike about the polished floor, the polished wooden furniture, the marble-topped chest of drawers with glass handles, and the cold greyness of the stone-built houses outside. I wandered about the suite of apartments, every now and then rubbing myself like a kitten against my mother's shoulder, and murmuring, "I don't know what to do." I tried drawing, but the pencil was bad and the paper greasy. I thought of reading, but there was no book there that I cared for. It was one of the longest days I ever spent. That evening my sister said to me, "Daisy, would you like to see a shepherdess, a real live shepherdess?" Now, I had read of shepherdesses in my Conte de Fées. I knew that they wore rose-wreathed Watteau hats, short satin shirts, and flowered silk overdresses, that spinning was part of their daily toil, and that they danced in village festivals, generally at moments when the king's son was riding by to the hunt. "Oh, I should like to see a shepherdess," I said. "But do you mean a real one, who keeps sheep and spins and everything?" "Oh, yes. She stands at her cottage door and spins while she watches her sheep, and eats a beautiful kind of yellow bread made of maize, that looks and tastes like cake. I dare say she would give you some if you asked her." The mention of the shepherdess dissipated my boredom. I climbed on my sister's knee and begged for a fairy story. "And let it be about shepherdesses," I said. My sister had a genius for telling fairy stories. If she would only write them now, as she told them all then, all the children in England would insist on having her fairy stories and none others. She told me a story that had a shepherdess in it, and a king's son, of course, a wicked fairy, a dragon, and a coach, and many other interesting and delightful characters. I went to bed happy in the knowledge that the fairy world was stooping to earth, and that the fairy world and this world of ours would touch tomorrow, and touch at the point where I should behold the shepherdess. I spent the next morning happily enough in drawing fancy portraits of the shepherdess, the king's son, and the wicked fairy. My sister lent me her paint and her best sable brush, and life blossomed anew under the influence of a good night's rest. In the afternoon we started out to see the shepherdess. Over the cobble-stones of the streets, among the little mountain torrents, we picked our way, and came at last to green pastures at the foot of the mountains. The Pyrenees were so bright in their snow-coats, touched by the sun, that our eyes could not bear to look at them. "We shall soon come to the shepherdess," said my sister cheerfully. "You must not expect her to be like the ones in fairy tales, you know." "Of course not," said I, but in my heart I did. We came presently to a sloping pasture, strewn with fragments of rock. "There she is," said my sister, "sitting on a stone spinning with her sheep round her." I looked, but could see no one save one old woman, the witch probably. "Where? I don't see her," I said. By this time we were close to the old woman. "There's your shepherdess," said my sister in English. "Look at her nice quaint dress and the spindle and distaff." I looked, but such a sight had no charms for me. Where was my flowered silk, Watteau-hatted maiden? Where was her crook with the pink ribbons on it? And as for the king's son, his horse could never have ridden up this steep hillside. It was a disenchanted world where I stood gazing sadly at a wrinkle-faced old woman in a blue woollen petticoat and coarse linen apron, a gay-coloured shawl crossed on her breast, a gay-coloured handkerchief knotted round her head. She had wooden shoes, and her crook was a common wooden one with a bit of iron at the end, and not a ribbon nor a flower on it. But she was very kind. She took us up to her little hut among the rocks, and gave us milk and maize bread at my sister's request. The maize bread was like sawdust, or a Bath bun of the week before last, but had it been ambrosia I could not have tasted a second mouthful. My heart was too full. I came home in silence. My sister was sad because the little treat had not pleased me. I did not mean to be ungrateful. I was only struggling savagely with the misery of my first disillusion. Like Mrs. Over-the-Way, I had looked for pink roses, and found only feuilles mortes. End of Part 7. Part 8. In Auvergne. We were to leave Bagnères. Imagine my delight when I found we were to travel not by train, but in an open carriage. In this we were to drive through the mountains, the mysterious snow-clad mountains, into Spain, where the Alhambra was, and oranges and Spanish nuts, and all sorts of delightful things. But alas for my hopes! My brother at home in England chose to have whooping cough, and so our horses' heads were turned north, and farewell for ever to my visions of Spain. We drove through lovely country to the other Bagnères, Bagnères de Luchon. On the way we passed a large yellow stone castle on a hill. Most of the castle was in ruins, but a great square tower, without door or window, still stood as strong and firm as on the day when the last stone was patted into place with the trowel. We wandered round this tower in vain, trying to find a door. "But it is that there is no door," said our driver at last. "Within that tower is buried a treasure. Some day a great wind will blow, and then that tower will fall to the ground, and then the folks of the village will divide the treasure, and become kings of France. It is an old prophecy." "But," suggested my mother, "has no one tried to get in and see if there really is a treasure?" The driver crossed himself. "The saints forbid," he said. "Who are we that we should interfere with the holy prophecy? Besides, the tower is haunted." We could not help wondering how far the ghost and prophecy would have protected that tower from English village boys. We drove on. Presently we stopped at a little wayside shrine, with a painted image of St. John in it, and a little shell of holy water. At the side of that shrine was a stone with an iron ring in it. Nothing more was needed to convince me that this was the entrance to a subterranean passage leading to the tower where the treasure was. Imagine the dreams that occupied me for the rest of the drive. If I could creep back at the dead of night to the shrine, a thing which, as a matter of fact, I would much rather have died than attempted. If I should pull up that heavy stone and go down the damp subterranean passage, and find the treasure in iron boxes, rubies and diamonds and emeralds, and beautiful gold and silver dishes, then we should all be very rich for the rest of our lives, and I could send Marguerite a talking doll that opened and shut its eyes, and a pony carriage, and each of the boys should have a new paint box with real moist colours, and as many sable brushes as they liked, 20 each if they wanted them, and I should have a chariot drawn by 4 tame zebras in red and silver harness, and my mother should have a gold crown with diamonds for Sundays, and a silver one with rubies and emeralds for every day, and— I imagine I fell asleep at this point, and awoke to find myself lifted out of the carriage at Bagnères de Luchon. I didn't go back and lift up the stone with the iron ring, but the dream was a serviceable one, and did duty nobly in idle hours for many a long year. In fact, I come across it unexpectedly sometimes even now. We spent a day or two at Bagnères de Luchon, and I believe it rained all the time. We drove in a drizzling rain across a rather gloomy country to see the Cascade d'Enfer. As my memory serves me, we crossed a dreary plain and entered a sort of theatre or semicircle of high black rocks. In the centre of the horseshoe, down the face of the rock, ran a thin silver line. This was the Cascade d'Enfer, eminently unimpressive on first view, but when we got out of our carriage and walked across the rough ground and stood under the heavy shadow of the black cliffs, the thin white line had changed and grown to a dense body of smoothly falling water that fell over the cliff's sheer edge and disappeared like a column of green glass into a circular hole at the foot of the cliff. "That hole goes down, down," said our guide. "No one knows how far, except the good God who made it." The water did not fill up the hole. An empty black space, some yards wide, was between us and the falling water. Our guide heaved a lump of rock over the edge. "You not hear it strike water," he said, and though we listened for some time, we did not hear it strike anything. That was the horror of it. We drove on the next day to St. Bertrand de Comminges, a little town on a hill with many steeples, whose bells answered each other with sweet jangling voices as we reached its gates in the peace of the evening. Most of this driving tour has faded from my mind, but I shall never forget the drive from Aurillac to Murat. We started late in the afternoon because my sisters wished to see the Auvergne mountains by moonlight. We had a large open carriage with a sort of rumble behind and a wide box seat in front. The driver, a blue-bloused ruffian of plausible manners, agreed to take us and our luggage to Murat for a certain price, which I have forgotten. All our luggage was packed upon his carriage. We too were packed in it, and we started. About 5 miles from the town the driver halted and came to the door of the carriage. "Mesdames," he said, "a young relative of mine will join us here. He will sit on the box with me." My mother objected that as we were paying for the carriage, we had a right to refuse to allow his friend to enter it. "As you will, madame," he said calmly, "but if you refuse to accommodate my stepson, a young man of the most high distinction, I shall place you and your boxes in the middle of the road and leave you planted there." 3 English ladies and a little girl, alone in a strange country, 5 miles from any town. What could we do? My mother consented. A mile or 2 further on, 2 blue-bloused figures got up suddenly from their seat by the roadside. "My father and brother-in-law," said our driver. My mother saw that protest was vain, so these 2 were stowed in the rumble, and the carriage jolted on more heavily. We now began to be seriously frightened. I know I endured agonies of torture. No doubt these were highwaymen, and at the nearest convenient spot they would stop the carriage and murder us all. In the next few miles, 2 more passengers were added to our number, a cousin and an uncle. All wore blue blouses and had villainous-looking faces. The uncle, who looked like a porpoise and smelt horribly of brandy, was put inside the carriage with us, because there was now no room left in any other part of the conveyance. The family party laughed and jolted in a patois wholly unintelligible to us. I was convinced that they were arranging for the disposal of our property and our bodies after the murder. My mother and sisters were talking in low voices in English. "If we only get to the halfway house safe," she said, "we can appeal to the landlord for protection." And, after a seemingly interminable drive, we got to the halfway house. It was a low, roughly built, dirty auberge, with an uneven earthen floor, the ceilings, benches and tables black with age, just the place where travellers are always murdered in Christmas stories. My teeth chattered with terror, but there was a certain pleasure in the excitement all the same. We ordered supper. It was now near midnight, and while it was being prepared, my mother emptied her purse of all, save the money promised to the driver, and a 10-franc piece to pay for our suppers. The rest of the money she put into a canvas bag, which hung round her neck, where she always carried her banknotes. The supper was like something out of a fairy tale. A clean cloth, in itself an incongruous accident in such a place. New milk, new bread, and new honey. When the woman brought in our bill, my mother poured out her woes, and confessed her fear of the driver's intention. "Nonsense," said the woman briskly. "He's the best man in the world. He's my own son. Surely he has a right to give his own relations a lift in his carriage if he likes." "But we had paid for his carriage. He has no right to put other people in when we are paying for it." "Oh, yes, he has," retorted the woman shortly. "You paid him so much to take you to Murat, and he will take you to Murat, but there was nothing said about his not taking anyone else, and he says now he won't take you on to Murat unless you pay him double the fare you agreed for. His horses are tired." "I should think they were," muttered my sister, "considering the number of extra passengers they have dragged." My mother emptied her purse on the table. "You see," she said, "here is only the money I promised your son, and enough to pay for our suppers. But when we get to Murat I shall find money waiting for me, and I will give him what you ask." I believe this conduct of my mother saved us at any rate from being robbed by violence. The inn stood quite by itself in one of the loneliest spots in the mountains of Auvergne. If they had believed that we were worth robbing, and had chosen to rob us, nothing could have saved us. We started again. My mother now began to make light of the adventure, and my terror subsided sufficiently for me to be able to note the terrible grandeur of the scenery we passed through. Vast masses of bare volcanic rock, iron grey in the moonlight, with black chasms and mysterious gorges, each one eloquent of bandits and gnomes, and an absolute stillness, save for the rattle of our carriage, as though, with vegetation, life too had ceased, as though indeed we rode through a land death-still, under the enchantment of some evil magician. The rocks and the mountains beyond them towered higher and higher on each side of the road. The strip of flat ground between us and the rocks grew narrower, till presently the road wound between two vast black cliffs, and the strip of sky high up looked bright and blue. The tall cliffs were on either side, and presently I saw with dismay that in front of us the dark cliff stretched right across the road. We seemed to be driving straight into the heart of the rock. In another moment, with a crack of the whip and an encouraging word or two, the driver urged his horses to a gallop, and we plunged through a dark archway into pitch darkness, for, with a jolt, the carriage lamps went out. We had just been able to see that we had passed out of the night air into a tunnel cut in the solid rock. Oh, how thankful we were then that the porpoise and all the rest of our driver's relations had been left behind at the halfway house. The driver lighted the lamps again almost immediately. He seemed in a better temper than before, and explained to us that this was the Great Arch under the mountains, and to me he added, "It will be something for you to remember, and to tell your children about when you are old," which was certainly true. That tunnel was unbearably long. As we rattled through its cavernous depths, I could not persuade myself that at any moment our driver's accomplices might not spring out upon us and kill us there and then. Who would ever have known? Oh, the relief of seeing at last a faint pinprick of light. It grew larger and larger and larger, and at last, through another arch, we rattled out into the moonlight again. Of course, I shall never know now how many of the terrors of that night were imaginary. It is not pleasant, even now, to think of what might have happened. At last we reached our journey's end, a miserable, filthy inn, and with a thankful heart saw the last of our blue-bloused driver. The landlady objected very strongly to letting us in, and we objected still more strongly to the accommodation which she at last consented to offer us. The sheets were grey with dirt, and the pillows grimed with the long succession of heads that had lain on them. A fire was the only good thing that we got at Murat. To go to bed was impossible. We sat round the fire, waiting for daylight and the first morning train. My mother took me on her knee. I grew warm and very comfortable, and forgot all my troubles. "Ah," I said, with sleepy satisfaction, "this is very nice. It's just like home." The contrast between my words and that filthy, squalid inn must have been irresistibly comic, for my mother and sisters laughed till I thought they would never stop. My innocent remark, and some bread and milk, the only things clean enough to touch, cheered us all up wonderfully, and in another 24 hours my mother and sisters were all saying to each other that perhaps, after all, there had been nothing to be frightened about. But all the same, I don't think any of that party would ever have cared to face another night drive through the mountains of Auvergne. End of Part 8. Part 9. La Haye. After our experience in Auvergne, the rest of our travel was so flat as to have faded almost entirely from my memory. As soon as we reached England, I was sent to a school of which I shall have more to say presently. There were only 20 girls. Mrs. MacBean was one of the best and kindest women who ever lived, a devoted Christian, with a heart large enough to take in all her girls. If I could have been happy at any school, I should have been happy there. And I was not actively unhappy, for I lived on my mother's promise that in July I should go back to her again. Where she was, I didn't know, but I knew she was looking for a pretty home for us all. I used to write letters to her addressed to St. Martin's-le-Grand, which I think I believed to be in Paris. At last the news came that she had decided to live at Dinan in Brittany, and that in 2 short days I was to go by boat and join her. One day passed. The next day at dinner I was hugging myself on the thought of the morrow. "Tomorrow," I said to the girl next to me, "I shall be going to my mother in France." "Oh no, dear," said the governess at the foot of the table. "Miss MacBean says you're not going till Wednesday." With a crash, my card castle came tumbling about my ears. Wednesday might as well have been next year, it seemed so far off. I burst into passionate weeping, just as the servant placed a large plate of steaming blackcurrant pudding before me. I saw through my tears how vexed Miss MacBean looked. She hadn't meant to break the news to me in this way. "Come, Daisy," she said after a while. "Don't cry, dear. Have some blackcurrant pudding, nice blackcurrant pudding." "I don't want any blackcurrant pudding," I cried. "I hate it. I never want any pudding again." And with that I rushed from the room, and from that day to this I have never been able to tolerate blackcurrant pudding. Everyone was very kind to me, but there was not anyone there who could at all understand the agony that delay cost me. I didn't care to eat. I didn't care to sleep or play or read. When my mother met me at Saint-Malo on the following Thursday, her first words were, "Why, how pale and ill the child looks." My sister suggested that it was the steamboat, but I don't believe it was. I believe it was the awful shock that came to me over the blackcurrant pudding. A long drive on a diligence, by miles and miles of straight white road, the fatigue of the journey forgotten in the consciousness that I was going home, not to a hotel, not to a boarding house, but home. The small material objects that surround one's daily life have always influenced me deeply. Even as a child, I found that in a familiar entourage one could be contented, if not happy. But hotels and boarding houses and lodgings have always bored me to extinction. Of course, as a matter of theory, one ought to carry one's intellectual atmosphere with one and be independent of surroundings. But, as a matter of practice, it can't be done, at least by me. I have a cat-like fondness for things I am accustomed to, and I am not singular in this respect. I once knew a woman who, after years of genteel poverty and comfortless economy, had an opportunity of a new life in comparatively affluent circumstances. "Why ever don't you accept it?" I said, when she told me of it. "I can't make up my mind to it," she said. "You see, I should have to leave the furniture." I felt some sympathy for her, though I hope that in her place I should have been strong-minded enough to make another choice. At last the diligence drew up at a crossroads, where a cart was waiting, and to this our luggage was transferred. It turned up one of the side roads, and we followed on foot. Up a hill wound the road, a steep wooded slope on one side, and on the other a high clay bank set with dainty ferns. Here and there a tiny spring trickled down to join the little stream that ran beside the road. We turned a corner by a farm, through a herd of gaunt pigs nearly as big as donkeys, the sight of which made me clasp my mother's hand more tightly. Each pig had a bar of wood suspended from his neck by a string, so that if he tried to stray through the hedge, the bar would catch and hold him back. All the pigs tried to walk over this bar as it hung against their forelegs. They never succeeded, but the action gave them all the air of high-stepping carriage horses. Then we walked a little further along the white road, and the cart turned in at a wooden gate. We followed along the carriage drive, which ran along outside the high red wall of the big garden, then through a plantation of huge horse-chestnut trees. To the left I could see ricks, cows and pigs, all the bustle and colour of a farmyard. Two great brown gates swung back on their hinges, and we passed through them into the courtyard of the dearest home of my childhood. The courtyard was square. One side was formed by the house. Dairy, coach-house and the chicken-house formed the second side. On the third side were stable, cow-house and goat-shed. On the fourth, wood-shed, dog-kennel, and the great gates by which we had entered. The house itself was an ordinary, whitewashed, slate-roofed French country house, with an immense walled fruit garden on the other side of it. There never was such another garden, there never will be. Peaches, apricots, nectarines, and grapes of all kinds lined the inside walls. The avenue that ran down the middle of it was of fig trees and standard peach trees. There were raspberries, cherries, and strawberries, and flowers mingling with fruits and vegetables in a confusion the most charming in the world. Along the end of the garden was a great arcade of black clipped yews, so thick and strong that a child could crawl on the outside of it without falling through. Above the dairy and coach house was an immense hayloft, a straw loft over the stable and cow house. What playrooms for wet days! Beyond the chicken house was the orchard, full of twisted grey apple trees, beneath whose boughs in due season the barley grew. Beyond, a network of lanes, fringed with maidenhair, led away into fairyland. My brothers eagerly led me around to show me all the treasures of the new home. There was a swing in the orchard, there were trees full of cherries, white and black. "And we may eat as many as we like," said Alfred. That afternoon we gathered a waste-paper basket full of cherries, and, with strenuous greed, set ourselves to empty it. We didn't succeed, of course, but the effort, so far as I remember, was attended by no evil consequences. We gave what we couldn't eat to the little black English pig, another of the treasures of the new home. There was a little black cow, there was a goat who resented with her horns my efforts after goat's milk. I learnt to milk her afterwards, though, and she grew very kind and condescending. Then there were 2 ponies, Punch and Judy, and Punch, my brothers told me proudly, was for us to ride. This was the crowning happiness. We had never had a pony of our own before. He was a tiresome, pig-headed little beast, that pony, but we loved him dearly. He had a way of pretending to be frightfully thirsty when you were out riding him, and when, in the kindness of your heart, you let him bend his head to a wayside pond for a drink, he would kick up his wicked little heels, and over his head you had to go. If he could rub you off against a tree as you rode across the fields, he would do it with all the pleasure in life. He was rather good at jumping, and he and I had some pleasant cross-country expeditions. But if anything in the nature of the obstacle you put him at happened to strike his fancy disagreeably, he had a clever way of stopping short at the last moment, when of course you went over his head. He threw me 3 times in this way one morning, but after that I was up to him. End of Part 9. Part 10. Pirates and Explorers. That summer was an ideally happy one. My mother, with a wisdom for which I shall thank her all my days, allowed us to run wild. We were expected to appear at meals with some approach to punctuality, and with hands and faces moderately clean. Sometimes when visitors were expected, we were seized and scrubbed and clothed, and made to look something like the good little children we were not. Then my brothers fidgeted awkwardly on their chairs, and tried to conceal their hands and feet, while I nibbled a biscuit or cake in an agony of shyness, not quite unrelieved by a sneaking appreciation of my fine dress, an appreciation for which my brothers would never have forgiven me had I been foolish enough to show it. But, as a rule, we were left to go our own way, and a very happy way it was. I don't mean that we were neglected. My eldest sister was always a refuge on wet days, when a fairy story seemed to be the best thing to be had. In the midst of all the parties, picnics and gaieties in which our elders were plunged, my other sister found time to read aloud to us, and to receive such confidences as we deemed it wise to make concerning our plans and plays. We had gauged the possibilities of the lofts correctly. With trusses of hay or straw, a magnificent fort could be made. I usually held the fort when the boys had built it, and the weakness of the garrison was lessened by the introduction of the 2 dogs, who defended it with me nobly, understanding perfectly the parts they had to play. We got the black pig up once, but that was a failure. When there was no time to organise a play, when it was not worth while to begin anything, because dinner or breakfast would be ready in a few minutes, it was a constant delight to scale the wall behind the stable, and watch the great wooden wheel slowly dragged round the circular stone trough where the apples for cider lay. The old, blind, white horse harnessed to the wheel went sleepily round and round. You could hear the crunch, crunch of the apples as the great wooden wheel went over them, and smell the sweet scent of the crushed fruit as you sat swinging your legs on the wall among the yellow stonecrop and sulphur-coloured snapdragon. Or, if you had the time to spare, what rapture to balance yourself on the edge of the stone trough and walk round it just behind the big wheel, knowing that if you slipped, you might fall on a muddy track outside, but that you were much more likely to fall into the trough itself, in which case your pinafore and stockings, we wore white stockings then, would be richly stained with apple juice to the colour of red rust. If the farmer were in a good temper, he would sometimes take you in to see the apples put in the press. You had to climb up by rough steps cut in the beams, if the press was nearly full. At the top, on a little platform, stood the farmer, drawing up the crushed apples from below by buckets full, and spreading them on their bed of clean straw with a wooden shovel. A layer of straw and a layer of apples, and when the press was full, the big beams screwed down, we hastened below to see the russet juice run out from its stone channel into the great vats. Though the farm adjoined our house, it was not our property, but as far as we children were concerned, it was just as good as ours, for the farmer allowed us the same privileges that he accorded to his own children. That is to say, if the farmer were in a good temper, we might watch any of the farming operations. If he were not, his own children had to keep out of the way, and so had we. There was a delightful pond in the field where the farm horses went to drink. It had a trampled muddy shore on one side, and on the other a high bank of yellow clay. We made a raft, of course, out of an old door and 2 barrels, and successfully sailed across to the yellow cliffs. "How nice it would be," I said, "if there were a cave in these cliffs. We could have no end of a good time, and be pirates and things." "You don't suppose," said Alfred scornfully, "that a pirate chief would wait to find a cave if he wanted one. He would make one, of course. I shall make one." "I don't believe you can," said Harry and I in a breath. "All right," said my brother, "you'll see." Next morning, when Harry and I went out to the field, there was Alfred, ankle-deep in water, shovelling out clay from the bank. "What a big hole you've made," said I. "I believe I could get into it if I curled up very much." "Ah," said my brother grimly, "you thought I couldn't do it." "Do you mean to say you aren't going to let us go shares?" said Harry, reading his brother's tone instantly. "Not a share," said Alfred firmly. "This is going to be my cave, and if I find anyone in it without my leave, I'll throw him to the alligators." "There aren't any alligators," said Harry. "There are only ducks." And indeed there were several swimming about the yellow waters of the pond. "All right," said Alfred cheerfully, sending a large spadeful of clay splashing into the pond. "I'll throw you to the ducks then. I dare say they'll do just as well." Alfred worked with what seemed to us superhuman vigour, and before evening there really was a hole in the clay bank big enough for him to get into, if, as I said, he curled himself up very much. "He'll be tired of it tomorrow," said Harry to me privately, reasoning from his former experience of his brother, "and then he'll let us have it." But the next day we found that the roof of the cave had fallen in. "No one need want to have it now," I said, but I was mistaken. The landslip, while filling up, had enlarged the hole, so that when the loose clay was cleared out, there was a space large enough for us all to have got in, even with the dogs. Alfred twisted some straw into a rope, and made it with string into a rough mat. This he put at the bottom of his rough cave. I timidly offered to help with this, but my offers were sternly rejected. "You said I couldn't do it,"
he said, and I'll jolly well show you I can. Harry came to me a little later, when I was feeding my rabbits. He's got it all so nice, he said. He's roofed it over with a hurdle, and he's put a bit of old tarpaulin over it, and he's fastening it down with big stones like the people in the Swiss Family Robinson. I wish he'd let us share in it. Look here, I said. Let's walk into town and get him a present. Then he'll see we're sorry we said he couldn't do it. In the broiling sun we walked the 5 miles into the town and back, returning with a large green sugar stick wrapped in coloured paper, which had taken all our halfpence to buy. With this we approached the pond. Alfred was sitting in his cave with the raft moored at his feet. I waved the sugar stick in the air. "Look here, Alfred," I said. "Here's a sucre de pomme for you. We've been all the way to Dinan to get it, and we're sorry we said you couldn't." "You little duffers," he cried. "I don't want your sucre de pomme. I only wanted you to say you were sorry. You needn't have walked 5 miles in a broiling sun to do that. You'd like to come over, wouldn't you?" he added, unmooring the raft. "We really didn't mean to vex you," I said, as he came across. "Not another word," he said handsomely, and rowed us to the cave. It was a very soft cave, and we had no means of breaking the sucre de pomme, so we took it in turns to suck it. Alfred, after some persuasion, consenting to join us in the feast, so as not to hurt our feelings, he said. That cave was a joy to us for many a day, though there was generally at least half an inch of water in it, and we didn't abandon it till the autumn rains had swelled the pond water and raised it above the level of our cave. It was a grand day for us when we first discovered our stream. It was 3 or 4 fields from our house, and ran through a beautiful meadow with sloping woods on each side. Its bottom was partly of shining sand and stone, and in some places of clay. We built dams and bridges with the clay. We caught fish with butterfly nets in the sandy shallows. We called it the Nile, and pretended there were crocodiles in it, and that the rocks among the woods were temples and pyramids. One day Alfred proposed that we should try and find the source of it. "We shall have to travel through a very wild country," he said. "Explorers always do, and we shall want a good lot of provisions, for I don't suppose we shall get back before dinner time. So you kids had better sneak as much bread and butter as you can at breakfast, and I'll sneak what I can out of the larder, and we'll start directly after breakfast tomorrow." We secured a goodly stock of provisions in an old nose-bag which we found in the stables, but it was so heavy that we were glad to hide it under the second hedge that we passed, and go on with only what we could carry in our pockets. We struck the river at the usual point. "I think we ought to wade up," said Alfred. "There are no crocodiles in this part of the river, but the lions and tigers on the banks are something awful." So we waded upstream, which is tiring work, let me tell you. "I don't see a single lion," I said presently, "but I'm sure I saw a crocodile just now under that bank." So we got out and walked by the stream's edge, on the fine, short, sun-warmed turf. But presently we came to the end of the field. The stream ran through a wood, and we had to take to wading again, but the water was much shallower, and it was easy. We ate some of our provisions sitting upon a large, flat, moss-covered stone in the middle of the stream. Then we went on again. Harry began to get rather tired. "We shall never find the source of the stream," he said. "I shouldn't wonder if it's thousands of miles away, somewhere up by Paris, I dare say. I vote we turn back." But his suggestion was howled down by the exploring party, and we went on. Through a meadow where the flax was drying in stocks, then through another wood we followed the stream, and then, with a thrill of delight, we saw that the water ran from a little brick tunnel, the mouth of which was draped in a green veil of maidenhair. I suppose it was about 4 feet high. "You'll turn back now," said Harry triumphantly. For an answer, Alfred stooped and plunged into the darkness of the little tunnel. I followed, and Harry brought up the rear. It was back-breaking work, but the floor was smooth. If we had had to pick our way, we could never have done it, for Alfred had only a few matches, and lighted one very occasionally. At last we found ourselves again in the dazzling sunlight, and behold, our stream was meandering through a wonderful swamp full of grasses and curious flowers, whose like I have never seen elsewhere. Our stream got narrower and narrower, but we followed it faithfully, and at last, crashing through a hedge, found ourselves in a roadway. Opposite us, in the high bank, was a little stone basin, into which water trickled from above. From this basin, a narrow stream of water, not more than a foot wide, ran across the road and under the hedge. This was the source of our stream, this, a wayside well we had passed 1,000 times. We finished our provisions, and knowing now where we were, went home by road. The swamp had coated us with black mud, almost from head to foot, and in this condition we marched gaily into the garden, where my mother was entertaining a company of rather smart friends at afternoon tea. The sequel was bed. End of Part 10. Part 11. The happy memories of that golden time crowd thickly upon me. I see again the dewy freshness, as of an enchanted world, that greeted us when we stole down, carrying our shoes in our hands, long before the rest of the household was astir. I smell the scents of dead leaves and wood smoke, and it brings back to me the bonfires on autumn evenings, when we used to play at Red Indians, and sit round the fire telling stories, and when that palled, dig out from the grey and red ashes the potatoes we had put there to roast, and eat the half-cooked, blackened, smoke-flavoured dainties with keenest appreciation. The rare days when we went to Dinard, and paddled in the shallow waters of the bay, between blue sky and gold sand, picking limpets from the rocks, and wishing for wooden spades, which Dinard then, at least, did not produce. A part of the infinite charm of those days lies in the fact that we were never bored, and children are bored much more often and much more deeply than their elders suppose. I remember an occasion when some well-meaning friends persuaded my mother that my education was being neglected. I was sent to a select French school, Mademoiselle Fauchet's, in Divan, but owing to some misunderstanding, I arrived 5 days before the other girls. Mademoiselle Fauchet kindly consented to overlook the mistake and keep me till the other girls arrived. I had a paint-box, which pleased me for the first day, but the boredom of the other 4 days is branded on my memory in grey letters. Mademoiselle Fauchet was busy in visiting her friends and receiving them. She took me out for a serious walk every day. We walked for an hour, and then Mademoiselle Fauchet returned to her visiting, and I to the bare schoolroom. I had brought few books with me, and these I devoured in an hour or 2. There were no books in the schoolroom but lesson books, thumbed, dog's-eared and ink-stained. There was no one to talk to save the severe cook, who was kind to me in her way, but didn't understand children. There was a grey-walled garden full of fruit that I must not touch, and a locked bookcase in Mademoiselle Fauchet's salon, full of books that I must not read. I was not conscious of being unhappy, only bored to extinction. On the 4th day, I persuaded Mademoiselle Fauchet to vary our prim walk round the town. She asked me where I would like to go, and I said La Fontaine. Mademoiselle Fauchet meant to be kind according to her lights, but she was the ideal schoolmistress, grey-haired, prim, bloodless. However, she conceded this to me, and I was grateful. We started for La Fontaine. La Fontaine is one of the show places of Divan, as it has a natural fountain of mineral water. There is a casino, where balls and fêtes and merrymakings are held, where bands play and little coloured lamps glimmer in the trees. All this awakened no associations, stirred nothing in me, for I had never been to a fête at La Fontaine. But below the platform on which the casino was built ran a stream, our Nile, on its way to join the river. The sight of it was too much for me. I remembered our happy exploring parties, the muddy dams we had built across it. I thought of the rabbits and the garden at home, and my brothers and my mother, and in the midst of one of Mademoiselle's platitudes on the beauty of the scene, I began to run. Mademoiselle Fauchet called after me. She even ran a little, I believe, but the legs of 50 are not a match for the legs of 10. I ran faster and faster down the avenue of chestnuts. I reached our meadow where our stream ran just the same as in the days when I was free to make a paradise of it. I ran on and on, up the slope, over the cornfield, across the road, through our own meadow, and never stopped till I flung myself into my sister's arms. Then, and not till then, the fact dawned upon me that I had run away from school. I don't recall the explanations that must have followed on my return. I know that I cried a great deal, and felt that I had committed an awful crime. I couldn't explain my feelings to myself, but I knew that in the same circumstances I should have done the same again, though I wept heartfelt tears of penitence for having done it at all. I think my mother must have understood something of what I went through, for she did not send me back. Another period of acute boredom came to me some years later, when I went to stay with some friends of my mother's in the north of London. They lived in a dreary square apart from the main thoroughfare, so that if you looked out over the brown wire blinds, you never saw anything pass but butchers' and bakers' carts. If I went for a walk, the sordid ugliness of Islington outraged the feelings of a child who had always found her greatest pleasures and life's greatest beauties in the green country. The people with whom I was staying were the kindest-hearted people in the world. They would have done anything to please me, if they had only known what I wanted. But they didn't know. That was just it. The dining-room was mahogany and leather, with 2 books in it, the Bible and Family Prayers. They stood on the sideboard, flanked on one side by a terracotta water bottle, oozing sad tears all day into a terracotta saucer, and on the other by a tea-caddy. Upstairs, in the drawing-room, which was only used on Sundays, were a few illustrated gift books, albums, and types of beauty, arranged on a polished, oval walnut centre table. The piano was kept locked. There were a few old bound volumes of Good Words, which I had read again and again. The master of the house, a doctor, was, my mother tells me, a man of brains, but I only saw him at meals, and then he seldom spoke. The lady of the house had a heart full of kindness, and a mind full of court circular. She talked of nothing else. Her daughters were kind to me in their way, and the games I had with them were my only relaxation. The doctor talked very occasionally of his patients, and this interested me. One night I went into the surgery, and found the bottles of medicine which his assistant had made up, standing in a row waiting for their white paper wrappers. I didn't in the least realize what I was doing, when I thought to escape from my boredom by mixing the contents of these bottles in a large jug, and then impartially filling up the bottles again with the mixture. When I had filled and corked them all, I slipped away. It was done in pure mischief, with no thought of consequences. But when I woke that night in bed, and suddenly remembered that I had heard that medicines that were given for some complaints were bad for others, and absolutely harmful, my heart stood still. Suppose some poor sick person died, whom doctor would have cured, because I had mixed his medicine with something else. I fully resolved to own up the next morning, but the next morning I reflected that perhaps some of the people that had taken my mixture might die of it, and then I should be hanged for murder. It seemed to me wiser to wait and see what happened. If anyone did die, and doctor were accused of poisoning his patients, I would come forward in a court of justice, as people did in the books, and own that I, and I alone, had been to blame, making my confession among the sympathetic tears of usher and jury, the judge himself not remaining dry-eyed. This scene so much appealed to me that I almost forgot that, before it could be enacted, somebody would have to die of my mixture. When I remembered this, I wept in secret. When I thought of the scene in which I should nobly own my guilt, I secretly exulted. I was not bored now. Whatever else might be the effect of my mixtures, they had certainly cured my boredom. Day after day passed by in spasms of alternate remorse and daydreaming. Every day I expected doctor to announce at dinner that some of his patients had breathed their last in inexplicable circumstances. But he never said anything of the kind, and when a week had passed, I was convinced that so good a doctor never gave anybody any medicine that could do them any harm in any condition, and that one of his medicines was as good for any complaint as any others. Whether this was so, or whether someone had been a witness of my act in the surgery and had remade the mixtures, I shall never know. But in the reaction following my anxiety, boredom settled down upon me more heavily than ever. I wrote a frantic letter to my mother, begging her to take me away, for I was so miserable I wished I was dead. Not having any stamps, I gave this letter to Mrs. to post. I don't suppose she thought she was doing any harm when she opened and read it, and I hope she was gratified by its contents. She added a note to my mother, begging her to accede to my request, and to take me away at once. It was years before I forgave her for reading that letter, and to this day I am afraid she has never forgiven me for writing it. My mother was at Penshurst at the time. I was sent down to her in deep disgrace, and my mother received me with gentle reproaches that cut me to the heart. My sister was exceedingly angry with me, perhaps with some cause, and pointed out to me how ungrateful it was to repay Mrs. by writing such a letter. I defended myself stoutly. I wrote it for Mamma and not for her. And though I was sorry for having hurt the feelings of one I knew had tried to be kind to me, yet I fear the verdict of my unregenerate heart was, serve her right. I felt that I was being unjustly blamed, and though I was sorry, I would not say so. And the next morning I wandered up through Penshurst churchyard, and through a little wicket gate into the park, where the splendour of a blaze of buttercups burst upon me. The may-trees were silver-white, the skylarks singing overhead. I sat down under a white may-tree. The spirit of spring breathed softly round me, and when I got up to go back, I was in love and charity with all men and all women, except Mrs. "I'm sorry if I have been naughty," I said to my sister. "I didn't mean to be, but—" "That will do," she said, skilfully stopping my confidences. "Now I do hope you are going to try and be a good girl, and to not make dear Mamma unhappy." "I will be good," I said. "Oh, I will indeed." and as long as I stayed among the golden buttercups and silver may bushes, I believe I was moderately good. End of Part 11. Part 12. When I began to write of the recollections of my childhood, I thought that all of those days which I remember could well be told in these 12 chapters. But the remembrances of that long-ago time crowded thickly on me, and I wandered in the pleasant fields of memory, where time ceases to be. So my 12th chapter is reached, and finds me still only 10 years old, and finds me, moreover, with not 1/10 of the events of those 10 years recorded. If only one's memory were as good for the events of yesterday, of last week, of last year. I have left myself no space to tell you of my adventures in Germany and France during the War of 1870, of my English school days, of much that is not ever to be forgotten by me. Since I must needs choose one out of many remembrances, I choose my Kentish home, dearer to me than all. After many wanderings, my mother took a house at Halstead. The Hall it was called, but the house itself did not lend itself to the pretensions of its name. A long, low, red brick house that might have been commonplace, but for the roses and ivy that clung to the front of it, and the rich, heavy jasmine that covered the side. There was a smooth lawn with chestnut trees round it, and a big garden, where flowers and fruit and vegetables grew together, as they should, without jealousy or class distinction. There were never such peonies as grew among our currant bushes, nor such apricots as hung among the leaves on the sunny south wall. From a laburnum tree, in the corner of the lawn, we children slung an improvised hammock, and there I used to read and dream, and watch the swaying green gold of leaf and blossom. Our garden ran round 3 sides of a big pond. Perhaps it was true that the pond did not make the house more healthy. It certainly made it more interesting. Besides the raft, which was but a dull thing when the boys were away at school, there were nooks among the laburnums and lilacs that grew thickly round the pond, nooks where one could hide with one's favourite books, and be secure from the insistent and irritating demands so often made on one's time by one's elders. For grown-up people never thought of spoiling their clothes by penetrating the shrubbery. Here, on many a sunny day, have I lounged away the morning, stifling conscience with Mrs. Ewing's tales, and refusing to remember the tangle of untidiness in which I had left my room involved. For I had a little room of my own, a little room, with a long low window, and a window ledge, where bright plants in pots, encouraged by the western sun, withstood the intermittence of my attentions, and blossomed profusely. My bookcase stood by this window, an old mahogany bookcase with a deep top drawer that let down to form a writing table. Here I used to sit and write, verse, always verse, and dream of the days when I should be a great poet, like Shakespeare or Christina Rossetti. Ah me, that day is long in coming, but I never doubted then that it would come. Here I wrote and dreamed, and never showed my verses or told my dreams for many a long month. But when I was 15, I ventured to show some verses to my mother. She showed them to Mr. Japp, then editor of Good Words and the Sunday Magazine, and never shall I forget the rapture of delight and of gratitude with which I received the news that my verses had been accepted. By and by they were printed, and I got a cheque for £1, a whole guinea, think of it. Now the day when I should be a poet seemed almost at hand, had I not had a poem printed. Besides the desk and the well-oiled key that formed so excellent a defence against the boys, for what young poet could ever set down a line with the possibility of even the best-loved brothers looking over her shoulder? My little room had another feature, by terms a terror and a charm. A little trapdoor in the ceiling led to that mysterious and delightful region between the roof and the beams, a dark passage leading all round the house, and leading to, oh deep and abiding joy, to a little door that opened on the roof itself. This, until the higher powers discovered it, was a safer haven than even the shrubbery. Enclosed by 4 pointed roofs of tiles was a central space, safe, secluded, whence one could see the world around, oneself invisible, or at least unseen. Another trapdoor, from the linen closet by the boys' bedroom, afforded them an equal access to this same paradise. We kept a store of books and good things in the hollow of the roof, and many a pleasant picnic have we enjoyed there. Happy, vanished days, when to be on the roof and to eat tinned pineapple in secret constituted happiness. It was an uneventful, peaceful, pleasant time. The only really exciting thing was the presence, within a stone's throw of our house, of our landlady's son, who lived all alone in a little cottage standing in the fields. He was reported mad by the world, eccentric by his friends, but, as we found him, perfectly harmless. His one delusion, as far as I know, was that he was the rightful owner, nay, more, the rightful tenant of our house, and about once in 6 months he used to terrify the whole household by appearing with a carpet-bag at the front door and announcing that he had come to take possession. This used to alarm us all very much, because if a gentleman is eccentric enough to wish to take possession of another person's house, there is no knowing what he may be eccentric enough to do next. But he was always persuaded to go away peaceably, and I don't think we need have been so frightened. Once, when he was in the drawing-room, being persuaded by my mother, I peeped into the carpet-bag he had left in the hall. It contained 3 empty bottles that had held mixed pickles, a loaf of bread, and a barrister's wig and gown. Poor gentleman, I am afraid he was very eccentric indeed. Did I say that his existence was our only excitement? Is it possible that I have forgotten the dreadful day when my brother Alfred shot a fox? He drew me mysteriously aside one morning after breakfast. "Daisy," he said, "can you keep a secret?" "I could," I asseverated. He drew me into his room, locked the door, and then opening a cupboard, displayed the body of a big dog-fox. "Where did you get it?" "I shot it." "Oh, poor thing!" "Poor thing indeed," repeated my brother indignantly. "Don't you know no one would ever speak to me again if they knew I had shot a fox?" "Then why did you?" was the natural rejoinder. "I didn't mean to. I was out this morning after wood-pigeons, and I saw something move in the bushes. I thought it was a rabbit, and I fired, and it was this. What shall I do with it?" "Bury it. We can have a splendid funeral," I said. "You baby." I was constantly forgetting that Alfred, at 17, was grown up, and that our old games no longer interested him. "Well, stuff it then." You will hardly believe it, but we really did try to stuff that fox. My brother skinned it skilfully enough, and we buried the body. We bought a shilling book on taxidermy. We spent many shillings on chemicals. We nailed the fox's skin to the inside of the cupboard door, and operated on it. My interest in the process was not lessened by the fact that I felt the fox, when stuffed, must be kept from all eyes but our own, hidden for ever in the depths of that cupboard, lest the world in general should find out that Alfred had shot a fox, and that I had been an accessory after the fact, and so should decline to ever speak to us again. But we never stuffed it. We never even succeeded in curing the skin, which, after a while, cried aloud for vengeance so unmistakably that we had to take it out and bury it secretly beside the body it had covered. Both interments were conducted in the very early morning, before even the maids were stirring, when the dew was grey on the grass, and the scent of the wet earth was sweet and fresh. When all the fox was buried, I breathed more freely. Perhaps no one would ever know, and people would go on speaking to us. I remember after the burial of the skin, we went for a walk through the long wet grass, and came home with wet feet and happy hearts. Oh, those dewy mornings, the resurrection of light and life in the woods and fields. Would that it were possible for all children to live in the country, where they may drink in, consciously or unconsciously, the dear delights of green meadow and dappled woodland. The delight in green things growing, in the tender beauty of the evening light on grey pastures, the glorious splendour of the noonday sun on meadows golden with buttercups, the browns and purples of winter woodlands. This is a delight that grows with one's growth, a delight that age cannot wither nor custom stale, a delight that the years who take from us so much can never take away, can but intensify and make more keen and precious. Nature never did betray the heart that loved her. My book of memory lies open always, at the page where are the pictures of Kentish cherry orchards, field and farm, and gold-dim woodlands starred with primroses, light copses where the bluebells and windflowers grow. Yes, bluebells and windflowers to me and to all who love them. Botanists who pull the poor pretty things to pieces may call them hyacinths and anemones. And most plainly of all, among the dream pictures, shows our old garden at home. There is a grey-walled garden far away from noise and smoke of cities, where the hours pass with soft wings among the happy flowers, and lovely leisure blossoms every day. There, tall and white, the sceptral lily blows. There grow the pansy pink and columbine, brave hollyhocks and star-white jessamine, and the red glory of the royal rose. There greeny glowworms gem the dusky lawn, the lime trees breathe their fragrance to the night. Pink roses sleep and dream that they are white, till they wake to colour with the dawn. There in the splendour of the sultry noon, the sunshine sleeps upon the garden bed, where the white poppy droops a drowsy head, and dreams of kisses from the white full moon. And there, all day, my heart goes wandering, because there first my heart began to know the glories of the summer and the snow, the loveliness of harvest and of spring. There may be fairer gardens, but I know there is no other garden half so dear, because 'tis there, this many, many a year, the sacred sweet white flowers of memory grow. End of Part 12.